Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently, who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight we're going to do someone that I knew personally, Ernie Banks, who died recently at the age of 83, the greatest Chicago Cub in the team's history. By way of introduction to Ernie Banks, let me play a sound that was familiar to anyone who grew up in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s.
There's a high fly, deep to left. Back. Hey! It's a home run for Banks. Attaboy, Ernie! Whee!
That was announcer Jack Brickhouse, and that happened to be Ernie Banks' 498th home run, but most of them sounded pretty much like that. Ernie Banks played for the Cubs for 19 years. Along with Honus Wagner, he's the greatest hitting shortstop in National League history. He made it into the Hall of Fame. He had 512 home runs when 512 home runs meant something. He hit them all for the Cubs. The only people who've hit more playing for one team are Mickey Mantle, Mike Schmidt, and Ted Williams. And despite the fact that he never got to play in the postseason because the Cubs, well, they weren't too good, he never lost his infectious optimism for baseball, and especially for Chicago Cubs baseball in Wrigley Field. It was he who coined the term the friendly confines of Wrigley Field, and he was known all over America for his term, "Let's play two today." I worked on the Wrigley Field ground crew in Ernie Banks' last 2 years, 1970 and 71, and I can tell you that his enthusiasm for the game and for the park was genuine. I can also tell you that he still owes me $5 for a cup of soup I bought him from the Japanese restaurant across the street, but we'll come back to that later. Here's ESPN's Mike Wilbon, originally from Chicago, to talk about Ernie Banks.
What did Ernie Banks mean to Chicagoans?
Oh, boy. He was the smile on a famous face that the city very much needed at the time. I mean, Chicago had some winning teams. I mean, the Bears won in 63 and the Blackhawks won in, I guess, 61. But there wasn't a lot of winning in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s in Chicago. And Ernie Banks was a guy who he made, I'm not going to say he made winning secondary, but if you didn't win, it didn't mean you couldn't go to the ballpark and have a great time. Let's play too. He was so approachable. He lived in a neighborhood, not in a gated community, not out in the suburbs. He lived on the south side of Chicago. People associate the south side with the White Sox. Chicago was an incredibly segregated city then. Ernie Banks and Billy Williams and those players, black ball players, lived on the south side of Chicago. You saw them. You could touch them. The uniforms on many of the Little League jerseys in my Little League said Ernie Banks Ford. He sponsored part of my Little League. I've lived every day of my 56 years, I guess, being aware of Ernie Banks, going to Wrigley Field, sitting in the stands to watch him play on some bad teams, some good teams. But he's the most important baseball player, I think, to ever play in Chicago, certainly for generations, really. I mean, for decades, the kids born in Chicago, lived in Chicago. Whether you followed the Cubs or the White Sox, you were still aware of and loved Ernie Banks.
As far as his baseball career goes, I think people who didn't get a chance to see him play, you can see the 512 home runs. You know, he's in the Hall of Fame. What was he like as a baseball player?
Well, I mean, he was the greatest shortstop probably of the first 75, 80 years. I mean, a lot of people would make the argument, Stan, that he was the greatest shortstop to come along until Cal Ripken. I mean, Ernie Banks hit so many of those home runs as a shortstop, two-time MVP, 1958 and 9, I believe, at shortstop. So, you know, you didn't have people hitting for the power numbers that Ernie Banks hit at that point in time in Major League Baseball. That came later when it became a much more glamorous position, a power position, and Cal Ripken certainly helped that. So Banks was a very unique player. Started off playing, I guess, at the beginning of his career, played in the Negro Leagues. Was, I believe, the first African-American ball player the Cubs had. And his demeanor, you know, the way he conducted himself and the way he handled himself in Chicago. At the time, there were a lot of star players people could get behind. I mean, whether it was Mike Ditka or Gale Sayers or Dick Butkus or Bobby Hull, so many great players. But Banks, man, Banks was the prince of the city from the time he first got to the Cubs. You mentioned those 19 years until the time he died today.
Well, Ernie Banks came out of Dallas. He was a Texan, served in the military for a while, and then he went to play for the Kansas City Monarchs. He was one of the last great ball players to come out of the Negro Leagues. He came out after Willie Mays, same time as Hank Aaron. When he was with the Monarchs, he played for Buck O'Neill, who taught him a lot of things, not only about baseball, but, you know, Kansas City was a jazz capital. There was a lot of things going on around 18th Street. So Ernie got a taste of the big city. He also got a taste of the racial segregation of the early 50s in the United States.
We slept on the bus, go to the store, get some sardines, peanut butter, and crackers, get back on the bus, sit in the back, and then when the bus was ready to go, you just start eating and going to the next town. And that was it, just, to sleep on the bus. And Buck O'Neill was right there, and he was telling, hey, we're going to the next town, you all do this and do that, and watch this and watch that, and don't do this. He gave us all the things to do and not to do, and you can't go to this store over here, and not this hotel, and just get dressed and go to the park and play. So that was about the size of it. He's giving us all the rules and everything, because he had the experience of being in those cities, and his life was that way. There was a lynching in one city in Kansas before we came in, and he had told us about that. Said, hey, we're going to the city, and they just had lynching over here. So that got our attention, and, looking around and wondering what's going on. And is this America that we live in? And anyway, we went there and played, and we left. Everything was quiet. People came to the game. They enjoyed it. And we got on the bus and went on to the next city. With Buck, and then later on, Elston Howard came, Kurt Roberts came. With their own group, I enjoyed being with them. The outside world just didn't exist that much. We're just together. That's one team. Togetherness.
He was an incredibly talented ball player, and it didn't take long for the Cubs to call him up as their first black player. They actually called him up with another black player, Gene Baker, who was a little older and had played with white players in the minor leagues before. And the Cubs in 1953-54 weren't very good. I think they thought that Gene Baker was the better player and Banks was sort of the throw-in, but they soon found out that Banks was clearly a special talent. He started his first game with the Cubs 6 days before Baker, so he was the first black player for the Cubs. They were in the middle of the integration movement. They weren't first and they weren't last. And Banks was a good shortstop. He didn't have great range because he had a bad knee from the military. He didn't have a great arm, but he caught everything that came his way. But his real talent was as a hitter. He was an incredible hitter. Like Aaron, he had quick wrists and incredible bat speed, especially when he picked a lighter bat when he came to the majors. And his characteristic movement at bat was that he would wiggle his fingers as the pitch came in. He developed a sort of a home run swing. He wasn't a contact hitter. His bat speed let him swing for the fences, and in Wrigley Field that was quite advantageous because the short fences meant he was going to get a lot of home runs. Until Alex Rodriguez came in, he hit more home runs than any shortstop in history, and it was by a large margin too. In fact, for much of his career, he was ahead of Henry Aaron in home runs. This was especially amazing since he had nobody in the order to protect him for the first half of his career until Billy Williams and Ron Santo came, and people like Bob Gibson and Don Drysdale used to throw at him regularly. He won the most valuable player in the league in 58 and 59, and that endeared him to Cub fans. He's one of the few players to win the most valuable player award in consecutive years. He did win a Golden Glove at shortstop in 1960, but his knee started bothering him and he really couldn't move. They tried to move him to the outfield. That didn't work. By this time, the Cubs were looking at young shortstops like Andre Rogers and later Don Kessinger, and so Ernie Banks moved for the second half of his career to first base. First half of the 60s, the Cubs weren't good, and he was the only thing you had to look forward to, him hitting home runs, but the second half of the 60s, the Cubs got quite good. Meanwhile, Ernie Banks became Mr. Cub. At the time, 500 home runs was the magical number, and he was chasing it after Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays, and actually Henry Aaron passed him up when he moved to Fulton Stadium in Atlanta. Cubs were good, but they blew a couple of pennants, and Ernie Banks' 500th home run was what everybody looked forward to. He finally hit his 500th home run off Pat Jarvis in the spring of 1970.
Entering the 1970 season, the Cubs' Ernie Banks needed 3 home runs to reach 500. The dramatic countdown started at Wrigley Field. Here's Ernie.
That's it. That's way back there. Back. 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 Ernie did it. Number 499.
Well, here it is, Tuesday, May the 12th, 1970. And Ernie Banks comes to bat with 2 out and nobody on in the Cub half of the second inning against Atlanta. Score, Atlanta 2, the Cubs nothing. Ernie Banks hitting .241 at the moment. 2 home runs, 13 runs batted in. 499 lifetime homers. Here we go. Foul ball, strike 1. He has narrowly missed getting a home run the last couple of days with triples high off that wall in left. Strike 1. Hits the ball, 1-1. The wind is not a big factor. It's out of the southeast at 7 miles an hour. Jarvis fires away. That's a fly ball, deep to left, back.
That's it. That's it. Hey, he did it. Ernie Banks got number 500. A line drive shot into the seats and left. The ball tossed in the bullpen. Everybody on your feet. This is it.
Here's the replay on it. Waist high, good line drive shot. Here it is, going into those seats in slow motion. Made it just over the wall, bounced in and out. And here is one of the great moments in baseball history in the United States of America, and particularly in Chicago.
That was a big moment. That was Jack Brickhouse calling it again. Here's Jack Brickhouse telling a story about Ernie Banks.
Well, my favorite Cub of all time, of course, is Ernie Banks. I was there for his 500th home run, and Ernie was a kind of a fella who could be so contagious. His enthusiasm was so great. He'd take you along with him. They tell one great story about Ernie over in Dubuque, Iowa, some kind of a fan club wintertime dinner. And this one fellow said, my 8-year-old boy is going to be brought over here by my brother pretty soon. And he's a big Ernie Banks fan. And we were at Wrigley Field last 4th of July, and you were playing the Phillies, and you got a home run in that first game. We got lucky. We got good box seats near the dugout. And so, boy, we were privileged to be near that home run. Now, in comes the 8-year-old. And they bring the 8-year-old up to meet Ernie. Ernie looked at him and he said, "Excuse me, but were you at Wrigley Field last July the 4th? "Yeah." He said, "Were you sitting near the dugout?" He said, "Well, yeah." He said, "In that first game against the Phillies, when I got a home run," he said, "I swear that I got that home run on account of you being there." I said, "You know, this kid looks like a good luck charm to me, and I'll bet you I can hit one for him." Well, now, if that boy lives to be 9,000 years old, do you think he'll ever forget Ernie Banks?
Yeah, I saw that kind of stuff up close and personal all the time. That was Ernie Banks. At the end of the season, his bat was slowing down. Leo DeRocher didn't like him. The Cubs were squabbling, and so he retired at 512 home runs. He was a first ballot Hall of Famer in 1977, and after that he became an ambassador for the Cubs. As Mike Wilbon said, he's the most beloved sports figure in the city of Chicago, and the Cubs erected a statue to him outside of Wrigley Field. I thought I'd read you an excerpt from a book by Scott Simon from NPR called Home and Away. He was a big Cub fan growing up on the north side of Chicago, and he wrote about Ernie Banks. Ernie Banks' most conspicuous characteristic was also for many his most incredible, his geniality. His incessant sunniness seemed undimmed by ceaseless loss and perpetual disappointment. The expansion of baseball in the early 1960s opened a new opportunity for the Cubs to post an unprecedented distinction. They became the first team to finish in 9th place. Mr. Wrigley's rotating college of coaches treated their most distinguished player gratuitously, rotating Ernie Banks from shortstop to left field to first base for no apparent reason, greater than to demonstrate their authority to degrade the league's most accomplished player. It's a beautiful day for a ball game. Let's play 2 today. In 1963, Ernie himself attempted something almost as imponderable. He ran for the Chicago City Council. As more incomprehensibly yet, an independent in a South Side district during the years that predominantly black wards were the driving pistons of Mayor Richard Daley's Democratic machine. Mr. Cub finished in club tradition, 3rd in a field of 4, occasioning the only political observation I ever recall from Charlie Grimm. For Christ's sakes, how the hell did he expect any goddamn votes from White Sox fans? Perhaps Banks might have improved his chances by running for office in Chicago under the slogan, "It's a beautiful day for an election. Let's vote twice today." You didn't have to be an agnostic or skeptic, merely a Cub fan, to wonder how he could mean that. Not just for a day, a 3-game series, a week, or month, but an entire season, an entire career. Doctor, tell me, at what point does unrewarded optimism become unsupportable fantasy? If you could not doubt Ernie Banks' sincerity, wouldn't you have to wonder about his sanity and your own? How could a generation growing weary and wary of hearing there's a light at the end of the tunnel not be suspicious of hearing a daily declaration from the greatest man to play on a wretched team since Robert E. Lee? But it's a beautiful day for a ballgame. Let's play 2 today. His smile was his weapon of choice against the catcalls of bigots, the beanballs of Don Drysdale, who was no bigot but a right-hand pitcher who hunted heads ecumenically, and the defeat of his own dreams. Ernie Banks was his own man as much as Muhammad Ali. That was Scott Simon on Ernie Banks. One of my regrets in life is that I bought Ernie Banks that cup of soup, and I sat next to him on the bench before games hundreds of times, but I never asked the questions that now I know I should have asked. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. And who else can we close with but Ernie himself, singing what else but Chicago, My Kind of Town. You know, when Ernie sings it, it sounds better than Sinatra.
I've always felt, when I joined the Cubs, that we were the most philanthropical team in all the sports in the world. We believe in giving rather than receiving. My kind of town, Chicago is the Wrigley Building. Chicago is my kind of town that won't let you down. It's my kind of town.
Ernie, forget about that $5 you owe me. The soup was on me.